G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 5 in my series on Sopwith Camelology videos. Part 1 and part 2 covered 2 chapters of Great Aircraft by Norman Macmillan, Popping Firecracker and Ubiquitous Fighter. The third video we had a long and interesting look at a modern test pilot's view. A fella called Dodge Bailey, who got to fly the Shuttleworth collection's freshly new manufactured Sopwith Camel. In the fourth video, we had a bit of a look at the early life and early times of Durban Victor Armstrong, who went on to become the supreme exponent of low-level aerobatics in a Sopwith Camel. And today, in this video, I think we should have a little bit of a look at his time after his first Tour of France, 7 months in 1916, flying over the Somme in a machine called a Morane-Saulnier Bullet, which had an 80 horsepower rotary engine, wing warping, aka the Wright brothers to twist the wings in flight in order to get some semblance of roll control. It was the Morane-Saulnier Bullet, which was the first Allied aircraft and the first aircraft in the First World War to be deliberately contrived, set up so that you could fire a machine gun forward in the direction of line of flight. And it relied, as I said in the previous video, on the relatively crude expedient of having U-bolts go through the propeller, a triangular wedge shape which had a trough cut in each of the V sides facing the machine gun, and that was made out of tempered steel, and it was hard, and the bullets were made out of solid copper, which was not as hard, and the theory was that whichever side of the V shape the bullet hit, it would be deflected. And yeah, people actually went up in the sky and fought with each other like that. Now, look closely at this. This is the shape and contrivance of a Morane-Saulnier's undercarriage. This is the opposite of the cabanes set up to function as a king post, through which, by pulling on these wires, the joystick was able to warp the wings. You'll also notice a great big huge spinner over the front of the rotary engine. There was an hypothesis floating around at the time to the effect that the presence of that great big spinner so far forward of the centre of pressure and the centre of lift, compared to the tiny weeny little tail fin, might be contributing to the instability of the Morane. So therefore this was a training bullet, an instructional bullet, and to make it just that little bit easier to fly, they took the spinner off it. I want you to fixate on the spinner, because in the previous video I fixated on the spinner, and I fixated on the spinner to the embarrassing degree to which, because of its spinner, I rapturously leapt to the conclusion that this was also a Morane, because look at the spinner. However, there's something wasn't quite right as I was speaking about it, and it finally came to me just as the video was uploading that that's all completely wrong for a Morane. Wrong, 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 wrong. What this is a deeper Dushan monoplane powered by a 160 horsepower gnome in September 1913. So wrong, wrong, wrong. Okay, so humble pie eaten. So the caption says, and they're talking about, say, the 12th of August 1916, this Morane bullet photo in DVA's album has no caption, which suggests it may have been his machine at the time. Note the wing warping wires. I'd also say, if you could see it as clearly as I can, it's got a Vickers or Maxim type machine gun. And Vickers and Maxim machine guns are capable of being synchronised with either mechanical or hydraulic mechanisms to fire between the propeller blades, whereas that looks to me like it's a Lewis type of a gun that's had the cooling shroud taken off it. You can't actually synchronise a Lewis gun to fire through between the propeller blades, but the Royal Flying Corps did operate Marine bullets with machine guns on with deflector plates at first, and then later with interrupter gear. But you're still talking a 80 horsepower monoplane with wing warping, inherently unstable in pitch, attempting to dive into the ground all the time, with a fairly ineffective rudder. And it was up against the wicked, evil, dreaded Fokker Eindecker E1, and then the E2 and the E3. But it was the E1 that first annoyed them all. Synchronised guns. But it had wing warping, and it was kind of brutally simple. This is a modern reproduction, and it's got a stationary engine under that cowling. And it's also, as you can see, it's got ailerons. It's got landing wires which are fixed. They don't twist the wing. I've just found another account of somebody on their first acquaintance with a Marine. That is a Marine. So you just watch that while we listen to what a fella called Willie Fry, had to say. The flight commander, Captain Eustace Grenfell, black-haired and glowering, had done a tour in France with No. 1 Squadron, going out with it from England and winning an MC and Bar military cross. After luncheon, Grenfell had a bullet wheeled out and ordered me to take it up, fly it around for a time and make 3 landings, adding, quote, "and I hope you break your bloody neck," unquote. As I soon learned, he meant no harm by this. It was just his way of being casual, though disconcerting to a terrified young pilot. Marine bullets were very small, so light they could not have weighed more than 10 hundredweight. Now, a hundredweight is 112 pounds, so we're talking half a ton. Engine and all, that one man could lift one up by a tail skid and wheel it in or out of the hangar. It had a round fuselage with a large spinner painted red on the nose attached to the propeller boss and the propeller. The spinners had a splendid streamlining effect and made the machine look exactly like an unlit cigar with 2 small wings attached. But the effect of the spinner was that only the cylinder heads of the engine received a direct stream of air for cooling. There also existed a theory that the spinners made the machine even more unstable laterally. They had a balanced elevator and warped banking control, both worked off the joystick, which made the control of the machine very light fore and aft and correspondingly stiff and heavy laterally, as one had to warp both wings by brute force to bank it all. They did not have a fixed tailplane with trailing elevator such as we were used to. It would have been easy to pull back the stick till the tailplane was nearly at right angles to the line of flight, and thus break the flimsy tail off. Anyhow, we had a flight of 4 of them in the squadron, the only ones used operationally in France in the RFC, and here I was having to fly them. I was numbed and almost speechless with fear at having to take the machine into the air, but I wasn't going to show it. My only consideration was how to manage to keep it in flight and in the air. After a few minutes, I began a very gentle wide turn to the left, not from choice, but because I was afraid of losing the aerodrome if I kept flying on a straight course much longer. I succeeded in coming round eventually, picked up the main road again, flew back past the aerodrome, and turned again somehow to approach into the wind, throttled down and glided in. Too fast, of course. However, I landed safely, which was almost miraculous, as I had been so frightened that my mind and wits had scarcely been functioning at all. Some of the spectators, anticipating a crash, began to disperse. After that, I was relieved to go back to the mess, but no less scared of the moraine. I see from my logbook that the next day I was sent up twice to look for hostile aircraft which had been reported on the front, so it was not long before one became operational. So that was kind of August, September 1916. And somewhere around that time, number 60 Squadron started to get the Newport 11 Bebe. Not entirely certain, but I think the 11 referred to 11 square metres of wing area. Durban Victor Armstrong there on the right, July 1916. There's another view of him. Newports of 60 Squadron lined up prior to an offensive patrol. More Newports of 60 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. During his time with 60 Squadron RFC, Durban Victor Armstrong scored 5 aerial victories, and on November the 30th, aged 19, he was promoted to lieutenant. Next, according to his service record from 1 to the 8th of December, Armstrong was reported as assigned to the machine gun school for a week. Was this a return to visit the gunnery school at Camiers, or was it a date erroneously assigned to that training already undertaken in August? We're given no clue in his photograph album. The remainder of his service with 60 Squadron flying those much more efficient Newports apparently passed without significant incident so far as Armstrong was affected. Action soon wound down as the year came to an end with long periods of bitterly cold and unflyable weather, but not without more casualties. In December, Eustace Grenfell, commander of sea flights, in September broke his ankle in a crash landing, and Duke Mientes replaced him. Scott describes Mientes as one of the best pilots and almost the most popular officer 60 ever had. At the end of the month, DVA's 1916 tour on the Western Front finally ended, and he was posted to home establishment just in time for Christmas. And while Mr. Newport was building his 11 square metre wing area Bebby, Mr. Sopwith was coming up with his pup. But pups were not yet at the front, and 60 Squadron was starting to meet the earlier versions of the Albatross D series fighters. These are fairly late series, you can see by the V struts on them. But these had a bigger engine and they had 2 guns. And even as they came out, the time when a pup could have been a war-winning fighter was pretty much over. It was almost obsolete just as it got there. Against the D series Albatross, the French built 110 horsepower Newport 17s with single Vickers gun could just about hold their own, despite the German pilots' 160 horsepower Mercedes engines and twin guns. As Jack Scott remarked in the squadron's history, the silver Newport was a good machine to fight in, but a bad one either for running away or for catching a faint-hearted enemy, as its best airspeed, even near the ground, rarely exceeded 96 or 97 miles per hour. However, the army authorities at home wanted British-built machines. So at the turn of the year, there appeared the Sopwith Pup, the British response to the enemy's high-performance Albatri. Albatri being the RFC's whimsical quasi-Latin solution to the awkward plural of Albatrossos, Albatros S. Delightful though it was, the Pup was powered by a Larone engine of 80 horsepower and for armament had only the standard solitary Vickers gun. It had been introduced for Royal Naval Air Service 12 months earlier, and in truth the era had now been missed when the Pup might have turned the aerial war in favour of the Allies. Might as well say Pup was a half-strength Camel with nothing wrong with it. However, while 60 Squadron swapped its Newports for the Pups, more or less to their chagrin, Durban Victor Armstrong, he was away having his rest after 7 months, and instead of going to a training squadron or direct to a home defence squadron, what he did was he went ferrying and test piloting, quoting from chapter 4 of Carson's book. To return to Durban Armstrong's role in the great scheme of things, we left him posted to home establishment on the 20th of December 1916 after a 7-month tour at the front. The following day he was transferred to Farnborough as a test and ferry pilot with the Southern Aircraft Repair Depot, brackets SAD, SAD. With the build-up and launch of the spring offensive, his duties constantly sent him between England, Scotland and France on a non-stop variety of missions. testing new and reconditioned aeroplanes, collecting and delivering all manner of machines, taking them for service at home and abroad, and occasionally being called upon to fly personnel about, including top brass. In France, the ferry pilots were stationed at number 1 Aircraft Depot St Omer. This was where machines had to be delivered for deployment in conflict, and from where many were also brought back. Armstrong would make so many trips to St Omer that it would become a second home, flying some of the aircraft from as far afield as Glasgow to the Channel ports and then over to France. He would return sometimes by air, sometimes by sea. On these duties, he crossed the Channel 88 times. Calculated as an average figure, this would equate to 1 Channel crossing for every 2 days of his 6-month tour. Following is a page from his album showing rare photographs of Armstrong about to take off in the first Bristol M1B monoplane to go to France. That's A5139, 110 horsepower Clerget 9Z. George Turner, promoted to captain, shown speaking to him, was officer in charge of ferry pilots, Central Aircraft Repair Depot, Aircraft Park, Lympney. It's known that DVA Test flew the monoplane upon its arrival at number 1 Aircraft Depot, St Omer, but until these snaps were discovered, it was not generally known that he also made the delivery for assessment. Tail view of the Bristol monoplane. Front view of the Bristol monoplane. Durban Victor Armstrong standing in a 3/4 rear view. As you can see, it's got a fixed horizontal stabilizer and the elevators trail from that. And the Bristol monoplane was the last monoplane in British service until about the 1930s, because they had such a miserable time with the Marines, with their all-flying tail planes, trying to keep pilots up to them, trying to replace them and keep them in the squadrons, because so many people were crashing them all the time. That, yeah, the Royal Flying Corps became the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Air Force had no monoplanes for the next 15 years. This one just barely squeezed through before the ban came in. Here we see first Sopwith pup being encountered by Armstrong. Armstrong taking off in a pup. Armstrong in the cockpit of a pup. Armstrong overflying in a pup. Somebody standing in front of a pup, probably Armstrong. These are all photos from his album. Next in his album is the Spad pictured above, a successful design in both French and British hands. His caption says nothing, but in the hallowed tradition of those who love to fly, he was already amassing a good collection of aircraft types for his logbook, and we may safely assume he lost no time adding the Spad to his list. By the end of the war, he was officially credited with having flown 47 different types. Doubtless unofficially, the total was much greater. And after the pup, there came the triplane. Particularly interesting aircraft he encountered at this time, the Sopwith triplane N533. One of the 2 early Sopwith triplanes delivered to the Royal Flying Corps, which he flew from the Royal Naval Air Service, stationed at Cranwell, Lincolnshire, to Farnborough. He is seen climbing into the cockpit prior to leaving. The triplane, known familiarly as the Tripe or Tripe Hound, was originally ordered by the Admiralty, whose air service and its equipment were separate to the Army's flying service, and who had their own contract with Sopwith Aviation. They first took delivery of triplanes in December 1916, after which the type was used extensively by the RNAS and saw significant naval action from February and throughout the spring of 1917. On its first appearance, this grand Sopwith invention immediately created something of a sensation for its performance and combat prowess. It could outclimb and outturn the Albatros D3, which was so outclassed by the Tripe Hounds that the Germans hastened to copy it. They produced numbers of different prototypes of their own, of which the most successful was the Fokker DR1. Later, like a year later, made eye-catchingly famous by Manfred von Richthofen's Circus. That's sadly a reproduction with a stationary radial engine. Fewer than 150 Sopwith triplanes were built, but they flew impressively and fought with distinction. Apart from some structural flaws, their main drawback was the time it took for repairs, with many key installations like the fuel tank being inaccessible without disassembly. The triplane had its fuel tank underneath the centre section, just like the pup did. It balanced well, it made the aeroplane lovely and easy to fly. Triplane had its fuel tank underneath the centre section, where you had to disassemble the whole aeroplane to get to the fuel tank. Made the aeroplane easy to fly because the weight was on the centre of gravity. The Camel put the pilot underneath the trailing edge of the centre section and put the fuel behind the cockpit, where it was really easy to get to the fuel tank to repair it in case it leaked, which is a not so minor factor, which was more or less completely overlooked by Dodge Bailey in his aerodynamics consideration and pilot's perspective of how the Camel behaved and why would anybody ever want to build a thing like that or design it to be like that. But yeah, that could be a big part of the reason. If you had to disassemble the triplane to fix a leak in the fuel tank, putting the fuel tank behind the pilot seat makes a lot of sense. It also means that if the fuel tank catches fire, the fire goes back behind the pilot, which is probably fairly useless when you consider the fabric covered tail surfaces. But you know, it's a consideration, perhaps, maybe. Just saying. Another snap from Armstrong's ferrying days is this naval Bristol Scout at Chingford Royal Naval Air Service Aerodrome just north of London. In May 1917, the German High Command launched mass daytime bombing attacks on London and southeast England using Gotha G4 heavy bombers based in occupied Belgium. It was part of an overall plan which included unrestricted submarine attacks on all Allied and neutral shipping. Main aim of the aerial attacks, as General Erich Ludendorff wrote, was the moral intimidation of the British nation and the crippling of their will to fight, in the hope that the British civilian population would overthrow their government and demand an end to the war. This grandiose scheme had very limited success. There were several direct hits scored, and the public became incensed at incursions over Britain and angry at civilian casualties, plus the frequent alarms had the effect of interrupting munitions and other production. In response, the British government determined on urgent reinforcement and restructuring of the London Air Defence Organisation, and new home defence squadrons were formed. Lieutenant D.V. Armstrong's next three postings were all to home defence, beginning with number 39 Squadron, one of the first HD squadrons to have been formed in April 1916 at Hounslow, and which had performed signally in defence of London against raids by Zeppelin airships that year. Indeed, the early HD squadrons were so successful against Zeppelins that the German airship service never recovered after October 1916, when Heinrich Maffei, their premier airship commander, had died in his flaming L-31 over Potter's Bar after bombing Cheshunt. That victory was achieved by Second Lieutenant W.J. Walston Tempest of number 39 Squadron, who was awarded the DSO. Number 39 flight had 3 flights, each operating from a different base in Essex. A flight at North Weald, Bassett in Epping Forest. B flight at Sutton's Farm, Rainham, southeast of Romford, later RAF Hornchurch. A flight at North Weald, Bassett. B flight at Sutton's Farm. C flight at Hainault Farm. This is a picture of a Gotha. As you can see, the propellers are behind the trailing edges of the wings. There are some people who hold this to be more aerodynamically efficient because the entire leading edge of the wing is untroubled by turbulence off the propeller. There are others who say it is more propulsively efficient because there's more or less nothing behind the propeller to get in the way of the propeller's throughput, slipstream, downblast, whatever you want to call it. And there are still others who say that the fact that the propeller has to cross the trailing edge turbulence of the wing once for each blade per revolution, chopping up the turbulence puts a whole lot of stress on the engine and chews away sufficient power as to negate any advantage from having unobstructed leading edges. The argument still goes on 100 years later as to whether it's better to have a tractor or a pusher propeller for pure efficiency. On 25th of May 1917, the date of the first mass Gotha raid, the peace of the small town English life was shattered at about 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon as people in the east prepared for their Whitsun holiday. There had been no air raid warning. Number 39 Squadron had 11 of these low-performance machines sent up, alongside 8 from Number 37 Squadron and 13 from Number 50 Squadron, although the better-equipped Royal Naval Air Service coastal bases were airborne ahead of them with their Sopwith pups and triplanes. But no home-based air defence aircraft managed to attack the Gothas until their deadly business was done, and in the space of about 90 minutes the German bombs killed 95 and seriously injured another 192. While the War Office hastily tried to re-establish the Home Defence Group, now largely depleted after the Zeppelin threat had been seen off, the Gothas continued with waves of attacks throughout the summer. The second took place on the 5th of June, ironically enough, immediately following a practice alert by squadrons of the Southern Home Defence Wing, which had sent up about 30 aircraft at 1500 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with instructions to patrol for about 2 hours. The first sighting of the bombers was at 1740 or 540, when the squadrons on patrol had returned to refuel. Nevertheless, about the same number of machines managed a quick turnaround to get airborne again, the first being from 50 Squadron at a few minutes after 1800, 6 o'clock, swiftly followed by flights from 37, 39 and 78 squadrons. Some 22 machines of the Royal Naval Air Service soon joined them. Among the 44 Royal Flying Corps aircraft that rose in hopes of intercepting the enemy that day were 9 assorted types that were scrambled from the aircraft parks at Hendon and Lympne, and one of their pilots was D.V. Armstrong, who availed himself of Sopwith Pup B1731, which this is not a depiction of, but beggars can't be choosers, which was due to join 66 Squadron in France the following day. He just happened to be on the ground at number 8 Aircraft Park Lympne, which had already suffered as a target in the first raid on 25th of May, when Gothas of Cag Hole 3 were prevented from attacking London due to the weather and chose Lympne as a secondary target. Without a system of speedy coordination with ground observers, the pilots themselves had very little hope of even sighting their adversaries. And on this date, only 5 of the aircraft, all Royal Naval Air Service, proved to have been able to make any kind of contact. Number 39 Squadron continued to field their handful of BE-12s until August, but in July they enjoyed the significant addition of 6 of the superior fast new SE-5s. These are SE-5As, but anyway, that were delivered to their Sutton's Farm base, where a group of experienced pilots were being concentrated to fly them. They included Lieutenant E.S. Edward Moulton Barrett and Captains G.W. Gilbert Merlis Green, W.H. Bill Haynes, J.I. James Mackay, and J.H.T. Trigger Gran. Gran had been personally involved in overseeing the provision of the SE-5s. With more intense Gotha bombing raids through June and into early July, the public outcry hastened the development of dedicated new fighter detachments supported by early warning systems. Number 39's group of experienced SE-5 pilots from Sutton's Farm would form the nucleus of a new 44 Squadron, while a new 61 Squadron was projected as an offshoot of 37 Squadron, and a new number 112 as an offshoot of 50 Squadron, so 3 squadrons become 6 squadrons. On Sunday, 8 July, the pilots of number 46 at the Western Front received orders with bewildering suddenness to fly over to Sutton's Farm in England, where they would commence home defence operations against the Gotha threat. On the same day, number 39 Squadron's B flight at Sutton Farm, including the anti-bomber combat detachment, received equally sudden orders to pack up and move north to Hainault Farm. On Monday, 9 July, in conditions of pouring rain, they arrived to settle in with the Squadron's C flight already based there, which included Captain O.V. Owen, Thomas and Lieutenant G.T. Gerald Stoneham, to form up the new number 44 Home Defence Fighter Squadron, to be established later in the month. Machines employed hitherto on home defence had not operated in formation under a group leader, as had become usual on the Western Front in the face of the German Jastas. All this would change once the bombing raids on England began. Since the huge Gothas worked in formations bristling with armament, home defence squadrons had to adopt new tactics against them. While practicing how to get off the ground as fast as possible, their key task was to develop the art of concentrated full squadron formation attacks upon powerfully armed groups of bombers with the aim of repelling or at least deterring their incursions inland. There is little information in official records about DVA's spell with number 39 Squadron, but it was in mid-July 1917, officially 15 July, that he joined them on an interim basis. It's believed that he flew number 2 in his flight in anticipation of the move to number 44. By 21 July, as well as 1.5 Strutters, the parent unit already had at least 10 of the latest Camel fighters on its strength. And on 24 July 1917, the new number 44 Home Defence Squadron came into being. After this, the remainder of number 39 reverted to operating the BE-12s based at North Weald Bassett as a safeguard against any further Zeppelin attacks. The factory Camels initially received had 130 horsepower Clerget 9B rotary engines with the Lang LP2850 propeller, recognisable by its fabric-covered tips. DVA is here pictured in probably the earliest photograph of B3826 with 130 horsepower Clerget and Lang LP2850 propeller, taken at North Weald Bassett Aerodrome in summer-autumn 1917. His wardrobe includes a thigh-length shearling leather coat with fleece collar. Okay, take note of the propeller. A very different unit to that one. There were continued experiments to the factory Camels with the configuration as deliveries came to Martlesham Heath that summer. Modifications had already been applied to the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter, improving the field of vision by converting it to house the pilot in the rear cockpit, and then Lewis guns were added on the upper wings as seen on the SE5 on the previous page. Et voila! Can't synchronise the Lewis gun, so you fire it above the propeller arc. Meanwhile, the 110 horsepower Lirone 9J engine, as seen here, became preferred to the Clerget, delivering better performance despite its lower horsepower rating, and this was significantly improved when the square tip Lang propeller, i.e. that one, which would have had quite a lot of tip drag from that big flat paddle blade, was replaced by the coarser pitch AD644 style of propeller. This configuration soon became standard. Number 44 Home Defence Squadron was officially formed on 24 July 1917 under Major T.O.B. Hubbard, Military Cross, at the 100-acre Hainault Farm Aerodrome. It's based throughout the war. Although the Camel was delivered in quantities to the Royal Naval Air Service, Number 44 was described by DVA as, quote, the first Sopwith Camel squadron in the RFC, which we may take to mean that it was the first to be wholly Camel equipped. For the record, number 70 squadron in France received a very early delivery on the 29th of June, but their remaining machines arrived only at the end of July. Designed to replace its predecessors, the Pup, whose single Vickers machine gun was susceptible to freezing up at high altitudes, the Camel acquired its typically frivolous nickname because of the metal fairing that protected its gun breeches against this problem, producing a hump in front of the cockpit. Never heard of that before this book. I thought it was to streamline the gun's mechanism. The Camel's double armament fitted as standard was one of its major developments. It was the first British fighter to mount the classic installation of side-by-side pair of synchronised Vickers guns firing through the air screw. The belt-fed Vickers was preferable to the Lewis gun used on other British aircraft because it had a higher rate of fire than the Lewis, which required a magazine change every 97 rounds. The Vickers also used a closed bolt mechanism, which was more reliable with the synchronisation gear. By the time 44 Squadron's brand new Camels began arriving on the 21st of July, there had been nearly 3 months of Gotha bombing raids while the RFC soldiered on with their 1.5 Strutters, plus an additional complement of BE-2Cs and Avro 504s. During this time, home defence had remained entrusted to a handful of courageous units using these types of underpowered and undergunned machines. Armstrong's first Camel was B3826, equipped with 130 horsepower Clerget 9B rotary, and it quickly became the machine on which reports of his astonishing prowess spread throughout the Corps. The date he took delivery is unknown, but it was built by the Sopwith factory at Kensington upon Thames and received by his flight by at least the 12th of August, the day when one of his first defence flights took place against a force of 13 Gothas targeting Chatham Docks. Some 139 defensive sorties were recorded that day, but few made contact with the enemy. Within weeks, No. 44 Squadron, now under the command of Captain Gilbert Merlis Green, was fully equipped with Camels, some with Clerget engines and some with Lirones. Soon, the intensive German bomber offensive was being successfully counteracted by effective early warning systems of telecommunications, which alerted the cordon of waiting home defence squadrons to incoming Gothas. The following photo is hugely reminiscent of Battle of Britain pilots awaiting similar warnings to scramble. Captioned, "Waiting for orders." Right to left. Brand, Adams, unknown. Craig, unknown, possibly Gran. Banks, Thomas. Cecil Lewis, lying with his back to the camera. Possibly DVA, lying in the foreground with his face hidden. There. By these means, the daylight bombing raids of 1917 were effectively brought to an end by as the summer months drew to a close. But there was no respite for the home defence squadrons. From September, they would have to contend with a new and daunting prospect: Gotha bomber raids at night. Thus, in 44 Squadron began DVA's partnership with the Sopwith Camel, an aircraft with which his name is forever associated. A tremendously challenging machine, it concentrated the masses of armament, engine, pilot and fuel with an overall length of about 7 feet. Where have we heard that before? Its notorious sensitivity on the controls was coupled with a powerful gyroscopic effect from the rotary engine that produced a natural torque which, once mastered, assisted in fast and responsive manoeuvring. J.M. Bruce, writing in Flight magazine, confirmed that it owed its success to its phenomenal manoeuvrability. Quote, "The elevator was extremely powerful and the ailerons sensitive, but it was the Camel's startlingly quick reaction to coarse handling that was the undoing of so many pilots who attempted to fly it. At full throttle, it was markedly tail-heavy, and in the absence of an adjustable tailplane made it tiring to fly. Others might disagree about those ailerons. In fact, their performance was, to put it kindly, disappointing, and occasioned significant adverse yaw, while the poor directional stability of the undersized vertical surfaces made the machine skittish when using the rudder." Just a point there, Camel had big ailerons, had them on both wings, but the downgoing aileron moved the same number of degrees deflection as the upward moving aileron on the opposite wing. What that was intended to do was to destroy lift on the wing that the aileron moved upwards, allow that wing to drop so that you could roll into the turn. Simultaneously generate more lift on the downgoing aileron because it increased the curve of that wing. And so that wing was supposed to lift itself up. What actually happens with equal movement ailerons is the downgoing aileron increases the curve. Increasing the curve means that you increase or change the lift coefficient. So yes, you make more lift, but there's a lift drag coefficient. To make more lift, you must make more drag. When you make more drag out on the right-hand wing of an aeroplane that you're trying to get to roll to the left, you do roll left, but you also yaw right. That's why aeroplanes have rudders, so that you can then apply rudder in the same direction that you want to roll into. And in fact, lots of aeroplanes, you can roll them quite satisfactorily just by giving a big footful of rudder in the direction you want to go. And as it commences to yaw, the outside wing flies faster than the inside wing, and without you touching the ailerons or changing the camber of the wing in any way, the simple fact it's flying faster will make it roll in the direction that it is yawing. Okay. Sorry for that little impromptu sidetrack. The Camel's métier was the dogfight, in which it excelled. It could turn in an astonishingly small radius thanks to its short fuselage and the concentration of weights. The torque effect from its rotary engine caused it to turn with greater alacrity to the right than to the left, and its ultra-fast right-hand turn was its great advantage, although the 90-degree precession induced the nose to pitch down. And once this happened, the inadequate top or left rudder could not bring the nose up again. So in the instant of turning to the right, the pilot learned to prevent the nose dropping by preemptively applying left rudder, which would feel decidedly odd. To make a fast right-hand turn without losing height, one had to push on full rudder before full bank. This was far from intuitive and would have caused no end of heartache, ending in many inadvertent spins. Plus, it would quickly spin if a turn were tightened too much. But once a camel pilot became accustomed to his sensitive mount and understood its idiosyncrasies, he found it an ideal fighting aeroplane. H.F. King, also riding in flight, observed that with the right hand on the stick, it was the deadliest fighting machine in existence. Even its tricks and vices could be transformed into virtues. If anyone may be said to have had the right hands for a camel, that person was Durban Armstrong. He was, of course, well used to the behaviour of French rotary engines, having flown them throughout the entire tour at the front in 1916. The Clerget presented no more problems than the Lorraine, and compared to pilots who were accustomed to stationary engines, he would have found the transition straightforward. RNAS pilot W.G. William Moore, one of the Camel's famous exponents, declared that it was like having a pair of wings strapped to your shoulder blades. Quote, once you knew them, you could do anything you liked with them and turn their peculiarities to advantage. They were wonderful in a dogfight because they could make the quickest change of direction of any machine that flew in that war. Its peculiarities made it the most manoeuvrable fighter ever built and the best all-round performer. Inevitably, stunting quickly became a favourite sport with the agile and responsive machine, and this was where DVA's prowess began to earn him a fast-growing reputation. Colonel Stanley Walters, a fellow South African who became a close friend of the Armstrong family after the war, vividly remembered what an impact he made as an unquestionably brilliant pilot. Quoting, the Camel was a completely unstable aircraft which could be likened to sitting it out when taming a wild horse. A right-hand turn was made with almost complete application of left rudder and bank, carefully coordinated, while the pilot had constantly to monitor the carburetor mixture adjustable from the cockpit for the Clerget engine. The Camel became a magnificent fighting machine in France, for to get a sighting on an aircraft with such behaviour and unpredictable performance in an adversary became its defence. Its unpredictable performance in an adversary became its defence. Yeah, it's a funny way to say it. The death toll in the training schools to qualify on the Camel in England was worrying, and morale was unquestionably at a low ebb. Yet the Camel was a remarkable success in France. In order to restore confidence, Durban Armstrong, whose magnificent flying of the Camel had become legendary, was withdrawn from his squadron, and he was sent round the schools to demonstrate and to describe how the machine could be mastered. His efforts bore fruit, and the flow of trained camel pilots was restored. Armstrong's ability in stunting, now termed aerobatics, was truly wonderful to watch. And if you want to see or hear what continues down here and across there, just go back a video, because in video number 4, we got right into the statistics of how many camels were built, how many enemy aircraft they shot down, how many camel pilots were killed, how many camels spun into the ground, how many camels crashed, how many camels crashed on training. We got right into that. DVA's Camel B3826 is seen third from the front in this lineup of 44 squadron camels, with several of A flight closest to the camera. His now familiar squadron marking of number 2 can be seen on the fuselage and turtle deck. A few in the line have adopted the comic configuration, with Lewis guns above their centre section. There's one, and there's another one. Okay, this is as good a time to clear that one up as any. When it said the comic configuration, this is a comic camel. Reason it's a comic camel is because it's set up for night fighting. If you have a bit of a look there, you'll see that the pilot's cockpit has been moved from between the centre section rear struts back to where the fuel tank should be. The fuel tank's been moved forward. They've got rid of the Lewis guns, the Vickers guns, because the Vickers guns, when they fire in front of the pilot, you've got all the muzzle flash in front of the pilot. And what we've got is two of the gun rails, normally used on SE5As, to run a Lewis gun on the top wing, and we have a pair of Lewis guns. One of them's down here in the load me up position. There's the little peg for the drum. There's a little peg for the drum on the other one. And the idea is you could do what the Germans thought they invented in the Second World War and have Schrage music, slanting music, jazz music, firing up from below, originally cobbled up for operating against Zeppelins. You could also reload them with the 97 round drums, but most important of all, from the position of the pilot sitting here, he can see a lot more without having his view blocked by the top wing. So it's better for approaching from below. And when he fires, he's got wing structure between him and the muzzle blast of the guns if he's firing forward. So that there is a comic Camel, specialised for night fighting. And apparently it was kind of optional. You might get sent to play with one, you might get sent to play with the other, or maybe if you were good at one, you stayed on that one. Because Armstrong never flew a comic Camel, not in operations. And when he was sent around the squadrons to demonstrate, he was flying a bog standard, normal Sopwith Camel F1. That's in 1917. 1918, yeah, he made some modifications to his Camel. We'll get onto them later. If you look closely there, you'll see the comic Camel has an AD 644 propeller on it. Possibly stands for Aircraft Park, whereas this Clerget Camel has the Lang LP 2850 propeller. They look like Langs. This is one of the Langs, LP 2850. That one I think is an AD 644 propeller. And of course there we have DV Armstrong. You'll see he's also got a little tiny aluminium spinner on the propeller hub. Members of 44 Squadron in September 1917. Bill Hayes is second from the right, linking arms with DVA, who was third from the right. Lieutenant A.E. Steve Godfrey's MC is at DVA's feet in front, courtesy of Peter and Matthew Craig. They felt the cold bitterly, which was exacerbated by flying at night, until in late 1917 the Sidcot suit came into service, which DVA can be seen wearing in the above photograph. It was invented by the Australian aviator Sidney Cotton, who discovered that his old grease-soaked coveralls resisted the cold far better than all those combinations of bulky fur and leather. His experiments produced an all-in-one flying suit which had three layers: a thin lining of fur, a layer of airproof silk inside the short shorn fur, and an outside layer of light Burberry material, that's oilskin. Its protection was greatly valued by the pilots who had to fly in piercing Arctic cold. Funny thing, when Private Les Wharton came off Gallipoli and went back to Australia as a corporal and went to England as a sergeant, when he was in England in 1916, he met one of his distant relations from Queensland in England. Now, the only distant relations that I'm aware of in southeast Queensland would be from his mother's family's people. His mother's name was Sarah Cotton, which was always regarded as a family joke because this fella's father, he grew up in a family of cotton spinners, and he left Yorkshire to come to Australia in 1882 so that he could get away from cotton. Came to Australia and he married Sarah Cotton. Sarah Cotton's father had been the Surveyor General for South Australia, fairly high up in the colonial administration, and he retired to become a big landowner in southeast Queensland. Sidney Cotton was a sort of a spendthrift who was sent to boarding school in England before the First World War. He played with petrol-powered model aeroplanes in 1910, maybe 1913. He joined the Royal Naval Air Service. He says he did a lot of things on Sopwith 1.5 strutters. Many of the things he said he did were under the Official Secrets Act until after he died. So he died without anybody checking a lot of the things that he said he did. I'm pretty sure that it was Sydney Cotton in England in 1916 at a time when he did not want to be posted to the Adriatic, flying seaplanes off a seaplane tender. And he managed. He'd been training for a long-range bombing flight over the Channel in the North Sea. That didn't come off, and he basically had a bit of a temper tantrum, and he resigned his commission and went back to Australia and expected to join the Australian Flying Corps, and they wouldn't have him because every time he tried to reapply, his application got stopped when it got as far as I guess, England. But anyway, I'm pretty sure it was Sydney Cotton, Les Wharton's second cousin, who told him, "Get the hell out of the trenches, mate. Get yourself into the Australian Flying Corps." So after he went to France, after he came back with a bullet hole in his shoulder and a military medal and a promotion to lieutenant and his choice of next posting, Les Wharton joined the Australian Flying Corps in England and went to Salisbury Plain and learned to fly on Avro 504Ks, transitioned through pups onto camels with 4 Squadron Australian Flying Corps, arriving there in August 1918, where he literally made the history books by getting lost on his first time going over the lines, becoming separated from his companions, and then, as a noob, attacking 2 LVG two-seaters, either one of which would normally require at least 2 pilots working in cooperation. He shot one down, then he ran away. Then he got attacked by half a dozen Albatross fighters. They put holes in his petrol tank, so he went and hid in a cloud. When he came out of the cloud, a fragment of anti-aircraft fire hit him on the head, knocked him unconscious. He spun down, came to his senses just before he crashed, managed to pancake on the British side of the lines, and according to family law, LORE, he retained the hub of his broken propeller as a clock mount on the mantelpiece, and he got appendicitis or a ruptured appendix in the crash, but they may be 2 garbled stories. But anyway, forgive the long-winded segue inspired by the mention of the Sid Cot flying suit, but yeah, not 1 pterodactyl in the ancestral tree, not 2 pterodactyls in the ancestral tree. I claim 3 pterodactyls in the ancestral tree. My mother's father, my father's uncle, my father's uncle's second cousin. Bit tenuous, but it's a connection. It certainly meant that I was a bit of a gone duck as soon as I read my first Biggles book. And so, back to the book. Armstrong's B-3826 underwent a few modifications over his time with 44 Squadron, including some obvious changes of the propeller boss spinner, as can be seen in photographs in this chapter. It came to be regarded as his own personal hack, and there seems to be a tone of regret where he writes in his photo album that he had to leave it on his next posting at the end of 1917. Just before departing 44 Squadron, he captions a group of 3 photographs as, quote, "My first Lerone Camel in 44. Trenchard had issued advice on 9th of December for all camels across the Corps to be equipped." Nice photo, that, isn't it? That one's captured DVA in the same machine coming out of a loop, with the 110 horsepower Lerone 9J, which then became the standard power plant at this time, with numbers of machines being converted at a unit level. It appears from these photographs that this particular machine's cowling was not factory produced for the Lerone 9J, and the portside view, there appears to be a Sopwith Company serial box visible in the legs of the airman at the tail. So although the number is not visible, this may well have been B3826 refitted. A useful clue as to the date is provided by the snow. Flying would have continued throughout a fairly mild and dry November-December in the southeast, with periods of light snowfall in the 3rd week of December. Only in the first 2 weeks of January 1918 was there a wintry spell with heavy snow, which would have kept most aircraft hangared. From our point of view, and in an age of inline and occasionally radial engines in light aircraft, the rotary is a rare and exotic bird. It may not be immediately apparent, therefore, what the pilot of a rotary engine had to contend with. Okay, rather than read all that stuff again, go back and have a bit of a contemplation session with video number 2, video number 3. That's where we got right into how to operate rotary engines. Also, we covered a fair bit of it in video number 4, Pilot's Accounts with Flying Camels. We will have a little bit of a diversion to have a look at this, which is a picture of a 50 horsepower Gnome Omega, which is one of the first rotary aero engine to be produced in quantity. Okay, so air comes in here, mixes with fuel, goes through the hollow crankshaft, goes into the crankcase, and these ones had a really interesting variation. They had a spring-loaded poppet valve in the crown of the piston. Under compression and under a power stroke, the pressure in the cylinder kept the poppet valve closed. During an intake stroke, the poppet valve opened and it permitted fuel-air mix to be sucked through the centre of the piston. Anytime the poppet valve got stuck, then on a power stroke, the spark plug ignited the mixture. The mixture would then fire down through the stuck poppet valve and come back out and blow out through the carburettor. That's why they had the downward angle on the air intake, so that it would blow the flame down rather than directly straight into the pilot's groin. They were smooth, they were light, they were powerful. They were better than a stationary engine when they came onto the market. Therefore, people loved them. With the partnership between engine and propeller being critical to the aeroplane's performance, the Clerget also left something to be desired with its initial Lang LP2850 propeller, recognisable by its fabric-covered square tips. It was better when paired with the coarser pitch AD644 propeller with its more curvy linear profile, but when the AD644 was then paired with 110 horsepower Liron, the result was noticeably superior, enabling a greater top speed, that's from the coarser pitch, improved rate of climb, that's because the 110 horsepower engine is lighter than the 130 horsepower engine, improved rate of climb, and a higher ceiling. The rotary engine and propeller were in effect one big piece of machinery rotating clockwise as viewed from the rear, making a massive gyro with a large radius of gyration, which was mounted on a light stick and rag framework. The key to understanding the Camel was its combination of instability and precession, which aided its lightning-fast right-hand turn, as described earlier. Test pilot and aerobatic specialist Neil Williams agreed with many others when he described the Camel as a gyroscope with wings. Then they basically go on to talk about how much castor oil it used, describes how to run the throttle. We've already been through that in the earlier videos. Okay, reading from here. Eventually, B-3826 passed into the capable hands of red-headed Charlie Banks, inevitably known as Sandy, whose trick flying was rated by Cecil Lewis alongside DVA's as the best ever seen during the war. Banks was one of a 44 squadron group who one day, after a well-oiled lunch, voted that DVA should lead them in an aerial tail chase over the English countryside. Lewis described them as taking off in all directions. I think we might transfer to reading direct from Lewis at this point. So I'll go to there. Well, you can feast your eyes on this photograph of an oil painting. Copyright AJC Lynn Williams, and I think it's probably been commissioned specifically to illustrate this book, along with at least two other paintings in this book, I mean. The President, on a mess visit to Stratford, had purchased a keg of old ale. When he got back with the spoils in a tender, it was just on lunchtime, so we all turned out to roll the barrel into the mess. The ale was broached and gushed out dark, mellow, and extremely intoxicating. The entire squadron voted it necessary to drink the mess president's health with 2 glasses apiece, and then one more for luck. Lunch became hilarious and finally rowdy. We were certainly not sober, but we were certainly not drunk. We were merely in excellent spirits. Then someone shouted, "Let's go up for a flip." This most original suggestion met with a chorus of approval. There was a stampede to the sheds. The machines were turned out. And then a brilliant idea struck me. Let's have an aerial follow my leader. Genius. We voted that Armstrong should lead the snake and took off in all directions. My flight sergeant told me afterwards it was a hair-raising sight. Machines staggered into the air at stalling speed, missed each other by inches, turned vertically within a foot of the ground, incited every kind of accident. But somehow nothing happened, and at last we managed to get into line, a long snake of 18 machines. Having achieved this unique and beautiful formation, we came careering back over the aerodrome about 10 feet up and set off contour chasing all over Essex. Of course, we were crazy, but that was the mess president's fault. However, after half an hour's hedge hopping and barn skipping, the effects of the ale began to wear off, so that when Armstrong saw some duck over the Thames marshes and gave chase, the rest of us couldn't be bothered to follow him, and one by one we all came back and landed, one ginger-haired hero excepted. On the tarmac, we found the General Officer Commanding Home Defence and his aide-de-camp talking with the squadron commander. Some question of gun testing targets or wind indicators took them out over the muddy aerodrome. It was here that Sandy spotted them. Whether he was anxious to show off his beautiful climbing turns, whether he resented people walking over the aerodrome where he wanted to land, or whether it was just Stratford ale and good spirits, heaven knows. But down he came like a hawk. The General Officer Commanding Home Defence was at first amused, screwing his monocle tighter into his eye, but soon he became alarmed, and finally sat, panic-stricken, in the mud, while the undercarriage of the camel shrieked by about a foot above his head, and the slipstream from the prop blew his beautiful brass hat off. Now, if you are a general, accustomed to the respect and deference of your subordinate officers, it is a little difficult to know how to deal with such a situation when sitting in the mud with a second lieutenant and a major on either side of you. This general replaced his hat, making some quite unprintable remarks about that pilot, resumed his dignity. The three walked on. But Sandy, not satisfied with this ignominious defeat of what I presume he thought to be 3 Tommies wandering about the aerodrome, he gave them the other barrel, as it were, and dived again. The result was precisely the same, except that the general managed to hold his hat on. By this time the seat of his trousers was sopping, his dignity had been outraged, and he was altogether a very angry general. It is a terrifying experience to be dived on by an aeroplane, particularly when the pilot is cutting it so fine. Besides, there is always the chance he may miscalculate by a split second and cut off the heads of his target with the undercarriage. So the general was annoyed and intimidated. Sandy, zooming up to about 500 feet, half rolled onto his back, laughing like hell. "I'll teach those ruddy airmen to go snooping about the aerodrome when I want to land," he said to himself, and fell out of his half-loop into a third, more gorgeous pounce. His objectives were still sitting angrily in the mud. This time he shaved them even closer than before, so that the general thought his hour had come and lay flat on his back, cursing. Meanwhile, the rest of us were standing in groups on the tarmac, first on one leg, then on the other, divided between wild hilarity at the ridiculous figure cut by the general and fear of what would happen to that perfect idiot, Sandy, when he came down. Once the machine was safely on the ground with the engine off, the general retraced his steps, recovering indignation and composure at every stride. By the time he got back to the sheds, all the pilots had mysteriously drifted away. The unfortunate Sandy was sent for to the major's office. When we heard he had been deprived of his Sam Brown belt and put in irons for 3 days, the squadron was not in the least surprised. His comment on returning to the mess was, "Well, I bloody well put the wind up him anyway. Now, lest you think that's some kind of an aberration, Winged Victory was written by a camel pilot who did 6 or 7 months flying in 1918, flying camels in France. And in that book, there are at least 3 accounts of different pilots at different times beating up or ground strafing without shooting at them officers in cars on the road, more or less for the fun of it. It seems that if they weren't flying a combat patrol, they were encouraged to go and blow the cobwebs out of their mind by just go for a general pleasure flight. And because in 1918, camels spent most of their time ground strafing because they had such outstanding vertical performance. You could dive them at the ground, they wouldn't go too fast because they had a lot of drag. Dive them at the ground with the engine on the blip switch, drop your bombs or fire your guns, let go the blip switch and go almost vertically straight back up out of the trench. So yeah, playing silly buggers with camels, dogfighting with rabbits at treetop height is absolutely perfectly normal. Par for the course, that's what they did it with them, you know. It may well have been a simple manifestation of those daring young men in their flying machines meme concept. But anyway, let's have a little bit of a listen to VM Yates on the subject of playing silly buggers with a Sopwith Camel down low. The further 2 days cessation of flying was felt by Tom as a lack. Although war flying was an occupation of which a very little sufficed, ordinary peaceful flying was a daily delight whose absence took flavour from the empty day. A half-hour's flight every morning, a dash up to 10 or 12,000 feet, some foolery among the clouds if there were any, then some contour chasing. That was the prescription to keep a man healthy and wise. So although there were no jobs in the morning, as the clouds were thick at 2,000 feet, Tom went up for amusement, and having justified the expenditure of oil and petrol by expending some ammunition on the ground target, so that his flight could be entered honestly into the books of record as firing practice, he set off over the countryside at a height of 10 feet and a speed of 100 miles an hour, jumping over whatever got in his way, full of the joy and excitement and unique bliss of flying a rotary scout. Fleeter than wind, lighter than gazelle, more powerful than tempest. For the first time in the recorded universe, this thing was possible. For the first time, the power and the speed and the legerity and the liberty kissed in circumstance. For a year, perhaps circumstance would hold, and there would survive a few hundred people who had flown with expert malice, that menacing spring heel of the air with license to do what the devil they liked. And thousands would not survive. The license was costly. Tom found several staff cars, and, bull sensitive to red hat bands, he charged down among them with all his thunder like charioted Thor, and saw them cower from his threat. Down, right into their car. It was risky. He was trusting his judgment within inches of disaster. Who cared? He zoomed up vertically away, using his rudder to swing his tail upwards on the top of the zoom so that he went into another dive. But he made no misjudgment, and his spirit appeased, he landed. So there you go. And now you know, like I said, there are at least another 3 descriptions of using a Sopwith Camel as an offensive weapon to assault high-ranking officers on the ground, literally for the fun of it. And it was more or less tolerated because you can't ask somebody to go flying around at treetop height to say 300 feet over enemy lines, over multiple ground machine guns, and expect them to take the risks of doing a low-level boot up on a road and frightening somebody who's in a staff car seriously. To somebody who 2 or 3 times a day goes and spends 1 or 2 hours being shot at by something like 20 or 30 machine guns continuously, yeah, the risks involved in playing with a Sopwith Camel at ground level, they're minuscule. When we're talking about somebody who's finally got a Sopwith Camel after having spent 7 months flying an 80 horsepower Marine Saulnier Bullet with wing warping over the Somme for the whole of the battle. Then when they get a hold of something that's got 40 extra horses, biplane wings, ailerons on top and bottom wings, all the masses concentrated, more power, more control, no inherent stability. But when you let go of the stick, instead of diving into the ground like the Marine does, it pulls its nose up and goes straight up, because that's what Sopwith Camels are good for. Then who can blame somebody who's 19 or 20 years old, who spent 7 months getting shot at while flying an almost uncontrollable piece of aeronautical excrement? If when they get a hold of a camel, they enjoy themselves with it, they play with it, they see what they can do with it. So let's just see a bit of a description of Armstrong with his camel. Without going into it too far, there's pretty good evidence to indicate that Durban Victor Armstrong was the first person to invent the slow roll, or the aileron roll, as opposed to the flick, snap, or barrel roll, which was the only way to roll an aeroplane that anybody had invented, discovered, before Armstrong came along. I could get deeply into all that, but I choose not to. Pretty sure in the previous video, number 4, we had a look at this painting. Now the story is that there was a line of Sopwith camels, and one camel was missing from the line. And Armstrong appeared at the airfield, and he dived through the gap at about 150 miles an hour and pulled out into a loop. And as I said in the previous video, you can see the trail of unburnt castor oil. Having gone through the gap once in a straight dive, pulled up into a loop, the little bugger, 20 years old, has then, he's gone through there once, there's his castor oil, he's coming back down, and he went through it again at 150 miles an hour. Now the camel had a 28-foot 6-inch wingspan. The gap was 39 feet. 28 foot 6, 39. He had 5.5 feet, 1.5 meters, not 2 meters, between each wingtip and the wingtips of the camels he was flying between. Paintings appear in the book by Annette Carson. The paintings are copyright AJC/Lynn Williams. As I said, more than likely, specially commissioned for the book. Here we have a description of the kind of aerobatics that Armstrong was literally ordered and paid to go around and perform on the Sopwith Camel squadrons. Imagine a small aerodrome to the east of London. A few hangars of the old type flank one side. On another side there are some trees. A narrow strip of tarmac extends in front of the hangars. There are low clouds and a slight fitful wind. A camel is wheeled out of its shed. Other pilots gather on the tarmac. A mechanic swings the air screw. The pilot tries his controls. The engine roars and fades. A hand waves from the narrow cockpit. The chocks are jerked from the wheels. The pilot turns his head quickly to right and to left. The engine roars again, and simultaneously, before the machine has started to gather way, the tail lifts. Now watch closely. The machine jumps forward, heeling onto the left wing. The left wingtip is brushing the grass as the machine rises. The machine rises as if it were being lifted from the ground, and a surprisingly large expanse of top plane exposes itself flat to the view of the spectators on the tarmac. The machine has turned vertically across the wind as it is taking off. It flattens out and vanishes around the corner of the furthest hangar like an express train into a tunnel. The sound of its engine dies for a second, then shrieks as the machine reappears 2 feet above the sheds. It comes down steeply towards the tarmac, turning slightly, and then, as its wheels skim the grass, it points its nose slowly skyward. At that height and in that position, it seems that the only possible manoeuvre open to the pilot is a zoom. But watch. Over. The machine goes on slowly turning its nose upwards until it is standing on its tail. Then the nose comes over on top, and the large expanse of that top plane again appears horribly close to the spectators below. It seems impossible that the machine should have room to flatten out before hitting the ground. One watches it almost panic-stricken, but it continues, without a falter or the slightest unevenness, to curve round. It curves round and its nose pushes straight for the tarmac, rushes straight for the tarmac. Its engine roars louder and louder. So close is it that the machine seems to have grown in size out of proportion to its surroundings. It curves round, and with a fortissimo crash of its engine right in the spectators' ears, it passes along over the tarmac, having completed a perfect loop at slow speed right down on the ground. No pilot could watch one of those low, slow loops without being dumbfounded with admiration and astonishment. But more extraordinary manoeuvres are in store. The Camel zooms after its loop, then falls towards the ground in a vertical side slip, flattens out, turns and comes across the aerodrome parallel with the tarmac, its wingtip about over the edge of the tarmac and some 10 feet up. Opposite the central hangar, it lunges up and round in a quick twist. The huge expanse of the top plane again flashes into view, to be succeeded by a close view of the lower plane and the undercarriage wheels. The machine wriggles, as it were, turns clean over, and is again flying level about 10 feet up. The pilot has performed a flick roll, starting and ending it some 10 feet from the ground. The whole display might last 5 minutes, but they were minutes so closely packed with the superfine execution of difficult aerobatics that the whole technique of flying seemed to be compressed into them. And finally, the machine would settle on the edge of the tarmac, placed there precisely as a man might place a piece on a chessboard. I had the pleasure of meeting the pilot who used to give these displays. The impression that they were the reckless work of a madman was soon dispelled when one heard his theories. Every detail of every manoeuvre had been worked out and practiced with almost inconceivable care at a safe height. And then the separate manoeuvres had been put together to form a carefully constructed whole, which, for sheer spectacular effect, exceeded any other flying exhibition. These were aerobatic displays which outdistanced the greatest subsequent marvels of fact or film, and which, had they been staged in peacetime, would have drawn all London. This pilot set a standard in aerobatics which in artistry and spectacular effect has never been surpassed. As we come to the end of the 5th video in the series, a little bit of a note on the point that Armstrong had figured out how he could get his camel out of all of these manoeuvres if anything went wrong. And he was a past master at spinning precisely and pulling the camel out. And if the camel didn't want to come out of the spin, he basically used to use a big burst of engine power to get some airflow over his tail surfaces so that he could change the attitude of the aeroplane. And I quote again from Annette Carson's book. Many pilots had cause to be grateful to DVA for technical advice he freely shared. In an article published in Cross and Cockade International in 1993, Trigger Grand described some of his own aerial antics, including an incident when he and Armstrong flew over to the coast at Southend for some practice flying and pretended to collide in midair. They were together in 44 Squadron during its first 2 months, and Grand described how in August 1917 he had the notion one day to put his machine into a rolling spin over the aerodrome at Hainault Farm. Quote, downwards it went with lightning speed, and very soon the earth was no more than 1,000 feet under me. Now, I said to myself, neutralise the rudder and put the elevator control stick forward as far as it will go. But no, round and round went my bus, and I thought I was a goner. Then I remembered Lieutenant Armstrong's words. Quote, as a last way out of it, I bust the motor. Unquote. That means give the motor a burst of power, not bust, burst. To do that in a Sopwith Camel with a rotary engine, it's really easy. You just lift your finger off the blip switch and the engine comes in at whatever throttle setting you've already had it set up for before you hit the blip switch. So then I remembered Lieutenant Armstrong's words. As a last way out of it, I bust the motor. I put my throttle full on, and to my delight, the aeroplane came under control again. However, the earth was already there, and the next moment I heard a bang, saw stars, and went out in the land of dreams. When I woke up, all the boys were standing around me. You had the luck of the devil, they said. But you notice, Armstrong's method of coming out of a spin by applying power actually worked. In the testimony of Turgev Gran, who he'd told the trick to and put it into effect when he needed to. So yes, Armstrong knew how to spin, loop and roll his camel. He invented the aileron roll. And in the next video, the 6th in this series, we will get into what happened on his last flight. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. With a little bit of luck, you're enjoying this as much as I am. Because after 50 years of wondering what is it about Sopwith camels that they're so good and yet they're sometimes so bad-mannered and bad-tempered and vicious and kill so many people who are trying to fly them? Now we've finally got this book, or I've finally got this book for my birthday, age 59. And it's such a really good ripping yarn that if not told now, then when? With coronavirus breathing up the cloaca of humanity. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.